In 1884, European powers gathered in Berlin to carve up Africa like a pie, without a single African present in the room. They drew borders with rulers, splitting communities and kingdoms to suit their imperial ambitions. Fast forward to today, and Africa is once again at the center of a global competition for influence and resources. But this time, the players have changed, the methods are different, and Africans themselves are increasingly calling the shots. Welcome to what many are calling the new Scramble for Africa, a 21st century geopolitical contest where China, the United States, Europe, Russia, and other powers compete for partnerships, resources, and strategic positioning across the continent. But is this really a new scramble, or is it something fundamentally different? And most importantly, what does it mean for Africa's 1.4 billion people? To understand what's happening today, we need to briefly revisit the past. The original scramble for Africa in the late 19th century was brutal colonization, violent conquest, resource extraction, forced labor, and the systematic underdevelopment of the continent. Colonial powers took everything from rubber to diamonds to human beings themselves, leaving behind economies designed solely to serve European interests. When African nations gained independence in the 1950s and 60s, they inherited these distorted economies and arbitrary borders. The Cold War immediately turned Africa into another chessboard, with the United States and Soviet Union backing different governments, fueling proxy wars, and supporting dictators who pledged allegiance to one side or the other. Then came structural adjustment in the 1980s and 90s, when Western-led institutions like the IMF and World Bank imposed harsh economic conditions on African countries in exchange for loans. Many scholars argue these policies further weakened African economies and sovereignty. So when we talk about a new scramble, we're talking about a continent that has experienced centuries of external interference, but also one that has learned from this history. Enter China. In the year 2000, China-Africa trade was around $10 billion. By 2020, it had exploded to over $200 billion, making China Africa's largest trading partner. This wasn't an accident. It was the result of a deliberate strategy. China's approach has been markedly different from traditional Western engagement. Through the Belt and Road Initiative and the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, China has invested hundreds of billions of dollars in African infrastructure, railways in Kenya, ports in Djibouti, highways in Ethiopia, hydroelectric dams in Ghana, telecommunications networks across the continent. Chinese companies and workers arrived to build what African governments said they needed. The Chinese pitch is compelling. We won't lecture you about democracy or human rights. We won't impose political conditions. We offer infrastructure, investment, and partnership without the colonial baggage. This no-strings-attached approach has been incredibly attractive to many African leaders tired of Western condescension. But critics point to serious concerns. Chinese loans have saddled some countries with unsustainable debt. When Sri Lanka couldn't repay loans for its Hambantota port, China took it over on a 99-year lease, raising fears of debt-trap diplomacy. There are complaints about labor practices, with Chinese companies sometimes bringing their own workers rather than hiring locally. Environmental standards have sometimes been questionable. And there's the matter of supporting authoritarian regimes without regard for human rights. Yet, it's crucial to note that many Africans don't see this as purely exploitative. They see roads where there were none, electricity reaching new communities, and foreign investment that actually builds things. The question isn't whether China's engagement is perfect, it's whether it's better than the alternatives they've experienced. The West has watched China's African expansion with growing alarm. For decades after the Cold War, Western powers had somewhat neglected Africa, viewing it primarily through the lens of humanitarian aid and crisis management. China's success has forced a strategic recalculation. The United States has responded with initiatives like Prosper Africa and the Build Back Better World Partnership, now evolved into the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, promising hundreds of billions of dollars in infrastructure to counter Chinese influence. The EU has launched its Global Gateway initiative with similar goals. The message is clear. We're back, and we offer a better model, one based on transparency, sustainability, and democratic values. But here's the challenge. Western engagement still often comes with conditions, demands for democratic reforms, human rights improvements, environmental standards, and economic liberalization. From a Western perspective, these are universal values that should be non-negotiable. From many African perspectives, they look like the same old paternalism, rich countries telling poor countries how to run their affairs. Moreover, the West has been slow to deliver. While China builds stadiums, railways, and airports quickly, Western projects often get bogged down in bureaucracy, feasibility studies, and environmental reviews. African leaders sometimes joke that by the time a Western project completes its impact assessment, China has already finished building. There's also the issue of hypocrisy. Western powers lecture about democracy while supporting authoritarian regimes when it suits their interests. They demand environmental standards while being responsible for the vast majority of historical emissions. They talk about free trade while maintaining agricultural subsidies that undercut African farmers. Here's what's fundamentally different about today's situation compared to 1884. African agency. This isn't a scramble happening to passive victims. African leaders and citizens are actively navigating, negotiating, and sometimes playing these powers against each other to their advantage. Consider Rwanda under Paul Kagame. It has partnered with China on infrastructure while maintaining strong ties with the West for aid and investment. It's positioned itself as a tech hub, attracting investment from American companies while also hosting Chinese telecommunications infrastructure. Rwanda strategically leverages its relationships to maximize benefits. Or look at how the African Union has developed the African Continental Free Trade Area, creating the world's largest free trade zone by number of countries. This is Africans taking control of their own economic integration, reducing dependence on any single external partner. Some countries have successfully renegotiated unfavorable Chinese deals. Zambia pushed back on debt terms. Sierra Leone canceled the $318 million Chinese-funded airport project after deeming it unnecessary. This shows Africans aren't simply accepting whatever external powers offer. There's also growing South-South cooperation. Turkey, India, Brazil, Gulf states, and other emerging powers are all increasing their African engagement, giving African nations even more options. Kenya has diversified its partnerships across Chinese, American, European, Japanese, and Gulf investors. But let's be honest about the challenges. African nations don't negotiate from a position of strength when they're economically vulnerable. Corruption remains a massive problem, with some leaders more interested in personal enrichment than national development. Infrastructure is desperately needed, making it hard to refuse offers even with problematic terms. And the continent still faces the legacy of underdevelopment, making quick wins tempting, even when long-term consequences are unclear. So why does all this matter so much to global powers? Africa isn't just important for its own sake, it's strategically crucial for the global order. First, resources. Africa holds about 30% of the world's mineral reserves, including critical materials for the green energy transition, cobalt for batteries, platinum for hydrogen fuel cells, rare earth elements for electronics. As the world moves away from fossil fuels, whoever secures access to these resources gains enormous strategic advantage. Second, demographics. Africa's population is young and growing rapidly. By 2050, 1 in 4 people on Earth will be African. That represents an enormous market, a massive labor force, and significant global weight. Africa will have more UN votes, more economic power, and more global influence. Third, geography. Control of ports, maritime routes, and strategic locations matters. China's base in Djibouti sits at the entrance to the Red Sea, through which much of the world's trade passes. Competition for port access reflects broader strategic positioning. Fourth, climate and migration. Africa is on the front lines of climate change, despite contributing least to it. How Africa develops will partly determine global carbon emissions. Climate impacts will drive migration patterns affecting Europe, creating political reverberations worldwide. So what should we make of all this competition for African partnerships? The key question isn't which external power is better for Africa, it's what kinds of partnerships actually serve African development. History suggests several principles. First, ownership matters. African-led development strategies succeed more than externally.
So, if you value this deep examination of political history and current power dynamics, subscribe to Clinical World Histories if you haven't already. We're building a community that refuses to accept surface-level explanations. Like this video to fight the algorithm and get this in front of more critical thinkers. Comment with your analysis, your disagreements, your questions.